The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence's house as Queen Camilla stood by the tall windows of her private sitting room. Her fingers traced the edge of her teacup, steam rising gently in the crisp London air. Today was different. Today, she would finally speak to Charles about something that had been weighing heavily on her heart for months. Camilla had always known that marrying into the royal family would mean sacrifices. She understood the protocols, the endless scrutiny, and the way her past would forever be examined under the harsh glare of public attention. But what she hadn't expected was how her own family would gradually become invisible to the man she loved. Her son Tom Parker Bowles had called the night before, his voice carrying a tone she rarely heard from him. Tom was usually cheerful, always ready with a joke or a story about his latest food-writing adventure. But last night, he sounded tired, almost defeated. "Mom," he had said quietly, "I don't think I should come to the Christmas gathering at Sandringham this year." The words had hit Camilla like a physical blow. Christmas at Sandringham was a sacred tradition, one that Charles had insisted on maintaining when he became king. For 3 years now, Tom and her daughter Laura had been invited, had been welcomed, had been part of the extended royal celebration. But this year, something had changed. "Why would you say that?" Camilla had asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Tom had paused for a long moment before responding. "Because I don't think the king wants us there, Mom. Not really. And I'm tired of feeling like we're charity cases at our own mother's family gathering." The conversation had continued for another hour, with Camilla trying to reassure her son while simultaneously grappling with the uncomfortable truth of his words. Charles had been different lately, more distant when her children were mentioned, more focused on what he called streamlining the monarchy. She had watched as invitations that once came automatically began to require discussion, as casual family dinners became formal events that somehow didn't include Tom or Laura. Now, as she waited for Charles to join her for their morning tea, Camilla reflected on how they had arrived at this point. It hadn't happened overnight. The changes had been subtle at first, so gradual that she had almost convinced herself she was imagining things. It started with small things. Charles would schedule important meetings during times when Tom or Laura were visiting. He would seem distracted when they spoke about their lives, their careers, their children. The warm interest he had once shown in Tom's successful food-writing career or Laura's work as an art curator had gradually cooled into polite, but distant acknowledgement. The palace staff had noticed too. Camilla could see it in their carefully neutral expressions when her children's names came up in conversation. The private secretaries who once eagerly arranged family gatherings now seemed to need multiple consultations before confirming any plans involving Tom or Laura. Even Mrs. Henderson, Camilla's longtime lady-in-waiting, had started choosing her words more carefully when discussing family matters. Charles entered the sitting room precisely at 9 o'clock, as he did every morning. He was already dressed for the day in one of his perfectly tailored suits, his silver hair immaculately styled, his posture straight despite his 75 years. He moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades being watched, analyzed, and photographed with every step. "Good morning, my dear," he said, leaning down to kiss Camilla's cheek. His lips felt cold against her skin, and she noticed that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something preoccupied about his manner, as if his thoughts were already focused on the day's official duties. "Good morning, Charles," she replied, gesturing toward the chair across from her. A palace servant immediately appeared to pour his tea, adding exactly 2 lumps of sugar and a splash of milk, just as he preferred. The servant retreated silently, leaving them alone in the elegant room filled with Camilla's personal treasures and photographs. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, a routine they had maintained throughout their marriage. Charles read through the morning briefing papers his private secretary had prepared, occasionally making notes in the margins with his fountain pen. Camilla watched him, studying the familiar lines of his face, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he encountered something that displeased him. She had fallen in love with this man decades ago, had waited through years of separation and scandal to finally become his wife. She knew his moods, his passions, his fears. She understood his deep sense of duty, his genuine desire to serve his country well as king. But, lately, she felt as though she was looking at a stranger, someone who had allowed the weight of the crown to change him in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Charles," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, "we need to talk about Tom and Laura." He looked up from his papers, his blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something that might have been guilt, but it passed so quickly she couldn't be sure. What about them? He asked, his tone carefully neutral. Camilla set down her teacup and leaned forward slightly. Tom called last night. He's thinking of not coming to Sandringham for Christmas. Charles's expression didn't change, but she noticed his fingers tightened slightly around his teacup. I see. Any particular reason? The casual way he asked the question sent a chill through Camilla's heart. There was no surprise in his voice, no concern, no indication that the idea of her son missing the family Christmas bothered him in the least. If anything, he seemed relieved. He feels unwelcome, Camilla said bluntly. He feels as though you don't want him or Laura around anymore. Charles set down his papers and looked at her directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured tone he used during official speeches, formal and distant. Camilla, you must understand that things are different now. I'm the king. Every decision I make, every person I associate with, reflects on the monarchy. We must be more careful about public perceptions, about maintaining the dignity and focus of the institution. They're my children, Camilla said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. They're your stepchildren. They've done nothing wrong. Tom is a respected food writer. Laura is a successful art curator. They're both decent, hardworking people who happen to love their mother. Charles sighed and rubbed his temple, a gesture Camilla recognized as his way of buying time when he was uncomfortable with a conversation. Of course they're good people, he said. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But we must consider how their presence at major royal events is perceived by the public and the media. The monarchy needs to project a clear, unambiguous image. Too many peripheral family members can dilute that message. Camilla stared at him in disbelief. Peripheral family members? Charles, these are my children. They're not peripheral to me, and they shouldn't be peripheral to you. You're being emotional about this, Charles replied, his tone becoming more formal. I need you to think rationally about what's best for the crown. The words hit Camilla like a slap. She had heard him use that phrase before, always when he wanted to end a conversation that made him uncomfortable. What's best for the crown had become his answer to everything, his justification for any decision that hurt the people she loved. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Charles looked startled by her sudden movement, his carefully composed expression cracking slightly. Don't you dare tell me I'm being emotional, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Don't you dare dismiss my feelings about my own children as irrational. I have given up everything for this family, for this institution. I have endured decades of criticism, of being called names, of having my every move scrutinized. I have stood beside you through every crisis, every scandal, every difficult moment of your reign. Charles started to speak, but Camilla held up her hand to stop him. I'm not finished, she continued. I have watched you become king, and I have been proud of you. I have supported every decision you've made, even when I disagreed with it privately. But I will not stand by and watch you push my children out of our lives in the name of some misguided idea about royal purity. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Charles sat very still, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. The decision has already been made, Camilla. The guest list for Sandringham has been finalized. Tom and Laura are not on it. The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Camilla felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. She stared at her husband, this man she had loved for so long, and realized that she was looking at someone she no longer recognized. You made that decision without consulting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I made that decision as king, Charles replied. Sometimes the crown requires difficult choices. Camilla turned and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where she had once imagined hosting casual family gatherings, where she had pictured her grandchildren playing on the lawn while she and Charles watched from the terrace. Those dreams seemed foolish now, naive fantasies from a woman who had believed that love could overcome the rigid protocols of royal life. Behind her, she heard Charles clear his throat. Camilla, please try to understand. This isn't personal. It's about the future of the monarchy. She didn't turn around. Everything is personal, Charles. Every choice you make affects real people with real feelings. My children aren't abstractions or political considerations. They're human beings who love their mother and who thought they were part of this family. They are part of the family, Charles said, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. No, Camilla replied, finally, turning to face him. They're not. Not anymore. You've made that very clear. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Charles's private secretary, Sir Oliver Thornton, entered with his usual apologetic smile. He was a thin man in his 50s who had served the royal household for decades, skilled at reading the emotional temperature of a room and adjusting his approach accordingly. "Your Majesties," he said with a slight bow, "I apologize for the interruption, but we need to review the final arrangements for next week's state visit." Charles seized on the interruption like a lifeline. "Of course, Oliver. We'll need to reschedule this conversation, my dear," he said to Camilla, already rising from his chair. Camilla watched as her husband gathered his papers and prepared to leave, effectively ending their discussion without resolution. This too had become a pattern, she realized. Whenever their conversations became too uncomfortable, too real, Charles would find an excuse to retreat into his official duties. "This conversation isn't over," she said quietly. Charles paused at the door and looked back at her. For a moment, his formal mask slipped, and she saw something that might have been regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Camilla," he said softly. "I truly am. But some things cannot be changed." After he left, Camilla remained standing by the window for a long time. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different shadows across the garden. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago, but something fundamental had shifted. She understood now that the man she had married was gradually disappearing, being consumed by the institution he served. She thought about Tom's phone call, about the hurt in his voice when he talked about feeling unwelcome. She thought about Laura, who had always been more sensitive than her brother, who would probably be devastated when she learned she wasn't invited to Sandringham. She thought about her grandchildren, who had been looking forward to Christmas at the royal estate, who had already started making lists of what they wanted to show their step-grandfather. The weight of Charles's decision settled over her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about Christmas dinner or family photographs. This was about the systematic exclusion of the people she loved most from the life she had chosen. It was about being forced to choose between her role as queen and her role as a mother. For the first time since becoming queen consort, Camilla began to question whether the price she was paying was too high. She had always known there would be sacrifices, but she had believed that love would be enough to preserve what mattered most. Now she was beginning to understand that the crown demanded more than she had ever imagined, more than she was sure she could give. The telephone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She answered it to find Laura on the other end, her voice bright with excitement. "Mom, I just wanted to confirm about Christmas. Should I bring something special for the children to wear? I know how formal things can be at Sandringham." Camilla closed her eyes, feeling her heart break a little more. She couldn't tell Laura the truth, not yet. She needed time to figure out how to protect her children from the full impact of Charles's decision while also fighting to change his mind. "Let's talk about that later, darling," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "I need to check on a few details first." After she hung up, Camilla made a decision. She wouldn't accept Charles's proclamation as final. She had spent too many years fighting for her place in this family to give up now. If Charles thought he could simply dismiss her children from their lives without consequences, he was about to learn otherwise. She picked up the phone again and dialed a familiar number. When the voice answered, she spoke with quiet determination. "Oliver, this is the Queen Consort. I need to schedule a private meeting with you this afternoon. We need to discuss the Sandringham guest list, and I believe there may have been some oversights that need to be corrected." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Sir Oliver responded. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll adjust my schedule immediately." As Camilla hung up the phone, she felt a familiar fire building in her chest. She had fought for her relationship with Charles against impossible odds for decades. She had endured public humiliation, media attacks, and social ostracism to be with the man she loved. She wasn't about to let royal protocol destroy her relationship with her children without a fight. The battle for her family was just beginning, and Camilla Parker Bowles had never been one to back down from a fight, even when her opponent wore a crown. Sir Oliver Thornton's office in Clarence House was a study in understated elegance and careful organization. Ancient leather-bound books lined the mahogany shelves, while framed photographs of royal events spanning decades adorned the walls. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the polished desk where Oliver sat reviewing documents when Camilla arrived for their meeting. The private secretary rose immediately as she entered, his practiced eye noting the tension in her posture, the determined set of her jaw. In his 23 years of service to the royal household, Oliver had developed an acute ability to read the emotional undercurrents that often determined palace policy more than any formal protocol. "Your Majesty," he said with a respectful bow, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace. Please, make yourself comfortable. Shall I arrange for tea? Thank you, Oliver. But this isn't a social call, Camilla replied, settling into the chair with the careful grace she had perfected over years of public appearances. I need to understand exactly how the Sandringham guest list was prepared this year. Oliver had been expecting this conversation since his brief encounter with the king and queen consort that morning. The tension between them had been palpable, and he had noticed the king's unusual haste to leave the room. In his experience, such domestic friction rarely remained contained within private quarters for long. Of course, Your Majesty. The guest list was prepared according to His Majesty's specific instructions, following the same general framework we've used in recent years, with some modifications he requested. Camilla's eyes sharpened at the word modifications. What sort of modifications? Oliver opened the leather portfolio on the side table and withdrew several typewritten pages. Even from across the small space, Camilla could see that the documents were marked with numerous handwritten notes and corrections. His Majesty requested that we focus on what he termed core royal family members for this year's Christmas gathering. He expressed a desire to, and I quote, maintain the traditional dignity of the occasion while ensuring appropriate media representation. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise the meaning behind Charles's instructions. Camilla felt a familiar anger building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting emotional with Oliver would accomplish nothing. He was merely following orders from the king. I see, she said evenly. And who, specifically, did His Majesty classify as core royal family members? Oliver's discomfort was evident as he consulted his notes. The guest list includes Your Majesties, of course, the Prince and Princess of Wales and their children, the Princess Royal and her family, the Duke of Edinburgh and his family, and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. Camilla noticed immediately what was missing from that list. And my children were not considered core family members? His Majesty felt that a smaller, more focused gathering would be. Oliver paused, clearly struggling to find diplomatic language for what had obviously been a difficult conversation with the king. He felt it would be more appropriate given current circumstances. What circumstances? Camilla's voice remained controlled, but Oliver could hear the steel beneath her polite tone. I believe His Majesty was concerned about recent media attention regarding the monarchy's public image. There have been several articles questioning the size and scope of royal family events, suggestions that the monarchy should be more streamlined in these times of economic difficulty for the country. Camilla stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where staff members were going about their afternoon duties. She recognized the groundskeeper who had been tending these gardens for 15 years, the same man who always made sure to plant extra roses because he knew they were her favorite. These were the people who formed the real backbone of royal life, not the distant media critics who wrote opinion pieces about royal excess. Oliver, she said without turning around, how long have you been working for the royal household? 23 years, Your Majesty. And, in that time, have you ever seen a guest list prepared without consulting both spouses? There was a long pause before Oliver answered. It's unusual, Your Majesty. Traditionally, such decisions are made jointly, particularly when they involve family members. Camilla turned back to face him. So Charles made this decision entirely on his own, without any input from me about my own children. Oliver's expression was carefully neutral, but his silence was answer enough. Camilla felt something cold settle in her stomach as the full implications of Charles's actions became clear. This wasn't just about Christmas dinner or royal protocol. This was about power, about who had the right to make decisions that affected their shared life. I want to see all the correspondence related to this decision, she said firmly. Every memo, every instruction, every communication between His Majesty and your office regarding the guest list. Your Majesty, I'm not sure that's... Oliver. Camilla's voice carried a quiet authority that stopped his objection. I am the Queen Consort. I am not asking for state secrets or classified information. I am asking to see documents related to a family gathering that directly affects my children. Surely I have that right. Oliver nodded reluctantly and returned to his desk, retrieving a thicker folder from a locked drawer. As he handed it to Camilla, she could see his internal struggle between loyalty to the king and respect for her position. Of course, Your Majesty. Though I should mention that some of these communications contain frank assessments of various family members. Camilla opened the folder and began reading through the documents. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Charles hadn't simply excluded her children from the Christmas gathering. He had systematically reviewed every aspect of their involvement in royal life over the past year, and found reasons to minimize their presence. One memo, dated just 2 weeks earlier, outlined Charles's concerns about Tom's recent television appearances promoting his latest cookbook. Another questioned whether Laura's work with contemporary art exhibitions aligned with traditional royal aesthetic values. A third document analyzed the media coverage of Camilla's children over the past year and recommended strategic distance to avoid what it termed narrative complications. But it was the final document that truly took Camilla's breath away. It was a comprehensive review of what Charles called peripheral royal relationships, which included detailed assessments of not just her children, but also several other extended family members. The tone was clinical, calculating, treating real people and relationships as strategic assets to be managed or discarded based on their utility to the crown. "How long has he been working on this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The initial discussions began approximately 6 months ago, Your Majesty. Following the coronation, His Majesty requested a comprehensive review of all royal family protocols and relationships." 6 months. For 6 months, Charles had been planning to systematically remove her children from their lives, and he had never mentioned it to her. While she had been planning family gatherings and sharing stories about Tom's career success or Laura's latest art exhibition, he had been plotting their exclusion. Camilla closed the folder and set it on the table with deliberate care. When she looked up at Oliver, her expression was composed, but he could see the hurt and anger in her eyes. "I want you to prepare a revised guest list," she said quietly. "One that includes my children and their families." Oliver shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid I would need specific authorization from His Majesty to make such changes." "Then, consider this your authorization. I am the Queen Consort, and I am instructing you to add my family members to the Christmas guest list. With the greatest respect, Your Majesty," the King's instructions were quite specific. "I cannot countermand them without his direct approval." Camilla stood up, her movement sharp and decisive. "Then, I suppose we have a constitutional crisis on our hands, don't we, Oliver? Because I am not requesting this change. I am requiring it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond a Christmas dinner invitation. Oliver had never found himself in a position where the king and Queen Consort were in direct conflict over an official decision. There were no protocols for this situation, no established procedures for managing a domestic dispute that had spilled into matters of state. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "perhaps it would be best if you and His Majesty could discuss this matter privately and reach a mutual agreement." "We did discuss it, Oliver. This morning. His Majesty made it quite clear that he considers the decision final and non-negotiable." Camilla's voice carried a bitterness that surprised even her. "Apparently, being Queen Consort doesn't grant me the right to invite my own children to family gatherings." Oliver remained silent, recognizing that any response he made would be inadequate and potentially dangerous. He had served the royal family long enough to understand that when marriages within the institution became strained, the repercussions could extend far beyond the immediate family. Camilla walked back to the window, her mind racing through the possible consequences of the stand she was taking. She understood that by challenging Charles's decision so directly, she was crossing into uncharted territory. Royal marriages had always involved complex negotiations between personal desires and institutional requirements, but those negotiations typically happened behind closed doors, resolved through compromise and mutual accommodation. This felt different. This felt like a fundamental disagreement about the nature of their partnership and her role within the monarchy. Charles seemed to believe that becoming king gave him unilateral authority over all aspects of their shared life, including her relationships with her children. She could not, and would not accept that interpretation of their marriage vows. "Oliver," she said, turning back to face him, "I need you to understand something. I have spent decades supporting this institution, supporting my husband, and adapting my life to serve the crown. I have endured public criticism, personal attacks, and constant scrutiny because I believed in the importance of this role and because I love Charles." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "But I will not sacrifice my children on the altar of royal protocol. They are good people who have done nothing to deserve this treatment. If Charles cannot see that, if he cannot find a way to include them in our family, then perhaps we need to reconsider what kind of family we're trying to create." Oliver's expression was grave as he absorbed the implications of her words. In his years of service, he had witnessed several royal marriage crises, but never one that seemed to strike so directly at the heart of the institutional structure itself. "What would you like me to do, Your Majesty?" Camilla considered her options carefully. She could continue to fight this battle through official channels, trying to convince Charles to change his mind through logical argument and emotional appeal. She could accept his decision and try to maintain her relationships with her children outside the official royal framework. Or she could take a stand that would force the entire institution to confront the contradictions between its public image as a family and its private treatment of actual family members. "I want you to schedule a formal meeting with His Majesty for tomorrow morning. Not a casual conversation, not a brief discussion between other appointments. A formal meeting with a written agenda and official minutes. I want to present him with a comprehensive proposal for including my children in appropriate royal family events, and I want his response documented." Oliver's eyebrows rose slightly. Such formality between spouses was almost unheard of in royal household management. Typically, domestic disagreements were handled through private discussion, with staff involvement limited to implementing whatever decisions the royal couple reached together. "Very well, Your Majesty. And if His Majesty declines the meeting or rejects the proposal?" Camilla met his gaze directly. "Then, I suppose we'll all learn what happens when the Queen Consort and the King cannot reach an agreement on fundamental family matters." The implication was clear, though neither of them spoke it aloud. If Charles continued to exclude her children despite formal objections, Camilla would be forced to consider more dramatic responses. In the modern monarchy, the Queen Consort's role was largely ceremonial, but her cooperation was essential for the smooth functioning of the institution. A public rift between the King and Queen Consort would be a constitutional and public relations disaster. After Camilla left Oliver's office, the private secretary sat alone for several minutes, staring at the documents spread across his desk. In his decades of service, he had helped navigate numerous family crises, diplomatic challenges, and media scandals. But this situation felt different, more personal, and more dangerous to the stability of the monarchy itself. He reached for his secure telephone and dialed a familiar number. When the call was answered, he spoke quietly but urgently. "Sir Michael, it's Oliver Thornton. We may have a situation developing that requires your attention. Can you come in this evening for a confidential discussion?" Sir Michael Hartwell, the King's principal private secretary, was the most senior civil servant in the royal household. If anyone could help navigate this crisis, it would be him. But Oliver wasn't optimistic about finding an easy solution. This wasn't a matter of protocol or public relations. This was about fundamental disagreements between two strong-willed people who happened to be the symbolic heads of the British monarchy. Meanwhile, Camilla returned to her private quarters and made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her public persona as the dutiful, supportive royal wife. She picked up her personal mobile phone and called Tom. "Darling," she said when he answered, "I need you to come to London tomorrow. There are some things we need to discuss about the family, and I think it's time you heard the truth about what's been happening." Tom's voice was cautious when he replied, "Mom, is everything all right?" Camilla looked around her elegant sitting room, filled with photographs of the family she had created through 2 marriages, decades of love, struggle, and compromise. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of clarity about what really mattered. "No, darling," she said honestly, "everything is not all right. But I'm going to do everything in my power to make it right again." After she hung up the phone, Camilla sat in the growing twilight, planning her next moves in what was becoming a battle for the soul of her marriage and the future of her family's place within the British royal family. The next morning brought an unusual tension to Clarence House that even the most junior staff members could sense. Cook mentioned to the housekeeper that the Queen Consort had barely touched her breakfast. The housekeeper noticed that His Majesty had requested his morning briefing be moved to his study rather than the usual sitting room. Even the grounds crew working outside seemed to move more quietly, as if responding to some invisible pressure within the building. Tom Parker Bowles arrived at Clarence House at precisely 10 o'clock, as his mother had requested. He had driven through the London morning traffic with a growing sense of unease, replaying his mother's phone call from the previous evening. In all his 48 years, he had rarely heard that particular combination of sadness and determination in her voice. As he was escorted through the familiar corridors toward his mother's private sitting room, Tom reflected on how much his relationship with this place had changed over the years. Initially, Clarence House had felt like foreign territory, a grand stage where he was always conscious of being an outsider looking in. Gradually, As his mother's relationship with Charles had solidified and eventually led to marriage, the house had begun to feel more welcoming, more like a place where he belonged. Now, walking these same corridors, Tom felt that old sense of displacement returning. The staff members he passed offered polite smiles, but there was something different in their demeanor, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. He wondered if they knew something he didn't, if the invisible networks of palace communication had already spread word of whatever crisis had prompted his mother's urgent summons. Camilla was waiting for him in her sitting room, but she wasn't alone. A man Tom didn't recognize sat in one of the chairs near the fireplace, dressed in the sort of understated but expensive suit that immediately marked him as someone important within the royal establishment. "Tom, darling," Camilla said, rising to embrace her son. Tom noticed immediately that she looked tired, as if she hadn't slept well, and there was a tension around her eyes that spoke of difficult conversations and harder decisions. "Mom," he replied, hugging her tightly. "What's going on? You sounded so serious last night." Camilla gestured toward the other man in the room. "Tom, I'd like you to meet Sir Michael Hartwell, your stepfather's principal private secretary. He's here because what we're about to discuss has implications that go beyond our family." Sir Michael rose and extended his hand with a practiced, diplomatic smile. He was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the sort of alert, intelligent eyes that suggested he had spent decades navigating complex political situations. "Mr. Parker Bowles," he said warmly, "I've heard a great deal about your work over the years. Your mother speaks of you with tremendous pride." Tom shook the offered hand, but his expression remained wary. He had learned to be cautious around royal officials, having witnessed too many occasions where private family matters had somehow become subjects of institutional analysis and management. "Thank you," he replied. "Though I have to admit, I'm not sure why my mother's private secretary needs to be involved in a family conversation." Camilla and Sir Michael exchanged a glance, and Tom caught the silent communication that passed between them. Whatever was happening, it had already moved beyond the realm of private family disagreement. "Please, sit down," Camilla said, gesturing toward the chairs. "I need to explain some things that have been happening, and Michael is here because these matters have unfortunately become institutional concerns." Tom settled into a chair, his journalist's instincts immediately alert. He had spent years writing about food and culture, but he had also developed a keen eye for reading people and situations, skills that were serving him well now as he assessed the gravity of whatever his mother was about to tell him. Camilla took a deep breath before beginning. "Tom, you know that Charles and I have been married for nearly 20 years now. You know how hard we all work to build a genuine family relationship, to find ways to blend our different backgrounds and obligations into something that worked for everyone." Tom nodded. He remembered those early years, the careful navigation of public scrutiny, the gradual warming of relationships, the slow process of building trust and affection between his mother's new husband and her children. It had taken time, but it had seemed to work. Charles had never tried to replace their father, but he had genuinely seemed to care about Tom, and Laura had shown interest in their careers and their lives. "Recently," Camilla continued, "Charles has been making decisions about our family life without consulting me. Important decisions that affect you and Laura directly." She proceeded to tell Tom about the Christmas guest list, about the systematic exclusion of him and his sister from royal family events, about the months of planning that had gone into what Charles called streamlining the monarchy. As she spoke, Tom felt a familiar cold anger building in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced as a child when playground bullies had targeted him because of his mother's relationship with the Prince of Wales. "So basically," Tom said when his mother had finished, "Charles has decided that Laura and I are embarrassments to the royal family, and he's cutting us out." Sir Michael leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Parker Bowles, I don't think it's quite that simple. His Majesty is under enormous pressure to modernize the monarchy while maintaining its traditional dignity. These decisions aren't personal, they're strategic." Tom turned to look at the private secretary with barely concealed contempt. "Strategic? You're talking about cutting ties with my mother's children, and you're calling it strategic? What's strategic about breaking up a family?" "Tom," Camilla said gently, "Michael isn't the enemy here. He's been trying to help me find a way to resolve this situation without creating a public crisis." "A public crisis?" Tom's voice rose slightly. "What kind of public crisis?" Sir Michael answered carefully. "If the Queen Consort were to take a public stand against His Majesty's decisions regarding family matters, it could create significant constitutional and public relations challenges for the monarchy. The institution depends on the appearance of unity between the king and queen consort. Tom stared at the private secretary for a long moment before turning back to his mother. Mom, are you telling me that you're considering some kind of public confrontation with Charles over this? Camilla met her son's gaze directly. I'm telling you that I cannot, and will not accept Charles's decision to exclude you and Laura from our family life. I've tried reasoning with him, I've tried appealing to his better nature, and I've tried working through official channels. None of it has worked. So what's the alternative? The alternative, Camilla said quietly, is that I stop cooperating with the fiction that we're a happy, unified royal family when the reality is that my husband is systematically destroying our actual family relationships. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Tom had never heard his mother speak so bluntly about her marriage, had never seen her express such direct criticism of Charles. Throughout all the years of public scrutiny and private challenges, Camilla had always maintained a facade of perfect unity with her husband. Sir Michael cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss the practical implications of various courses of action before making any final decisions. Camilla turned to look at him with an expression that made clear she was no longer interested in diplomatic language or institutional concerns. Michael, the practical implications are quite simple. Either Charles finds a way to include my children in appropriate family events, or I stop participating in the charade that his version of family values represents anything meaningful. And if you stop participating? Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. If I stop participating, Camilla replied, then Charles will have to explain to the British public why his wife is no longer appearing at his side for official events. He'll have to find a way to maintain the image of stable family leadership while dealing with the reality of a queen consort who refuses to continue pretending that everything is fine. Sir Michael looked genuinely alarmed. Your Majesty, surely there must be some middle ground, some compromise that could satisfy everyone's concerns. Camilla laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Michael, I've been compromising for decades. I compromised when Charles's first marriage was falling apart, and I was blamed for it. I compromised when we had to wait years to marry because of public opinion. I compromised when I had to accept a lesser title than previous queens because of my history. I've compromised on everything from the guest lists at our wedding to the way I dress in public. She stood up and walked to the window, her voice growing stronger as she continued. But I will not compromise on my children's place in this family. They have done nothing wrong, and they deserve better than to be discarded because some palace advisors think they complicate the royal narrative. Tom watched his mother with a growing sense of admiration and concern. He had always known she was strong, had witnessed her resilience through decades of public criticism and personal challenges. But this was different. This was Camilla drawing a line in the sand that she was prepared to defend regardless of the consequences. Mom, he said gently, are you sure this is the battle you want to fight? I mean, Laura and I can handle being excluded from royal events. We've both managed to build good lives independent of all this. We don't need Charles's approval or inclusion to be successful or happy. Camilla turned back to face her son, and he could see tears in her eyes for the first time during their conversation. But I need it, she said softly. I need to know that the man I married, the man I've stood beside through everything, values my happiness enough to find room in his life for the people I love most. I need to know that becoming queen consort didn't require me to stop being a mother. The raw emotion in her voice was more powerful than any of her earlier anger. Tom realized that this wasn't really about Christmas dinner or royal protocol. This was about his mother's fundamental identity and her place within a marriage that had required enormous sacrifices from the very beginning. Sir Michael seemed to recognize that the conversation had moved beyond his ability to manage diplomatically. Perhaps, he said carefully, I should schedule another meeting with His Majesty to discuss potential modifications to the current arrangements. No, Camilla said firmly. No more meetings, no more discussions, no more attempts at diplomatic solutions. I want you to prepare a formal letter to Charles outlining my position. I want it to be absolutely clear that this is not a negotiation. This is a requirement for the continuation of our marriage as it currently exists. Your Majesty, Sir Michael said, his voice strained, I must advise against such a direct approach. If His Majesty were to receive such an ultimatum, particularly in writing, the consequences could be. Could be what, Michael? Could be that we finally have an honest conversation about what this marriage actually means? Could be that Charles has to choose between his institutional advisors and his wife? could be that the British public learns that even royal families have to deal with the same fundamental questions about love, loyalty, and sacrifice that affect every other family. Tom stood up and moved to his mother's side. "Mom, whatever you decide to do, Laura and I will support you. But I want you to be absolutely certain that this is what you want. Once you draw this line, there might not be any going back." Camilla reached out and took her son's hand. "Tom, I've spent the last 20 years trying to prove that I deserve Charles's love and the public's acceptance. I've bent myself into shapes I never thought possible, and I've been grateful for every moment of happiness I found along the way." She paused, squeezing his hand tightly. "But I won't spend the next 20 years watching Charles systematically erase my children from our lives while I smile and pretend it doesn't matter. Some things are worth more than crowns and public approval." As Tom looked at his mother's determined face, he realized that she had already made her decision. The question now wasn't whether she would challenge Charles, but how dramatic that challenge would become and what it would cost both of them. The battle for the heart of the royal family was about to begin in earnest, and everyone in the room understood that the outcome would reshape not just one marriage, but the entire future of the British monarchy. The formal letter was delivered to King Charles III at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning, placed on his breakfast tray alongside the daily briefing papers and correspondence that typically occupied his morning routine. The palace staff who handled the delivery noted nothing unusual about the envelope bearing the Queen Consort's personal seal, though they might have moved with slightly more care had they understood the explosive contents within. Charles was in his study at Highgrove House, having retreated to his beloved country estate the previous evening after what his private secretary had diplomatically described as a challenging day at Clarence House. The study was his sanctuary, filled with books on architecture and organic farming, watercolor paintings he had completed during peaceful weekend afternoons, and photographs of the gardens he had spent decades cultivating. It was here that he came when the weight of kingship felt too heavy, when the endless demands of constitutional duty threatened to overwhelm his sense of personal identity. He opened Camilla's letter expecting perhaps a further discussion of Christmas arrangements or a gentle attempt to revisit their previous conversations. What he found instead was 2 pages of carefully crafted, unambiguously worded ultimatum that left him staring at the paper in stunned silence for several minutes. The letter began formally, addressing him as Your Majesty rather than the My Darling Charles that typically opened her personal correspondence. That alone should have prepared him for what followed, but nothing could have adequately warned him of the directness with which she laid out her position. She wrote that after careful consideration and consultation with appropriate advisors, she had concluded that his recent decisions regarding her children represented a fundamental breach of the mutual respect and family unity that formed the foundation of our marriage. She outlined specific instances over the past 6 months where Tom and Laura had been systematically excluded from family events, decisions made without her input or consent. The letter went on to detail what she termed non-negotiable requirements for the continuation of their marriage in its current form. She demanded that Tom and Laura be included in all appropriate family gatherings, including the upcoming Christmas celebration at Sandringham. She required that any future decisions affecting her children be made jointly, with her having equal voice in determining their involvement in royal family life. But it was the final paragraph that truly took Charles's breath away. Camilla wrote that if these requirements were not met within 1 week, she would begin declining official engagements and public appearances until the matter was resolved to her satisfaction. She made clear that this was not a temporary negotiating tactic, but a permanent change in her approach to royal duties unless her family relationships were respected and protected. Charles set the letter down on his desk and walked to the window overlooking the gardens where he had spent so many peaceful hours planting plantings and contemplating the cyclical nature of growth and renewal. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was reading about the potential destruction of his marriage while surrounded by the evidence of his ability to nurture and sustain life through careful attention and patient cultivation. His first instinct was anger. How dare Camilla threaten him with what amounted to a public embarrassment? How dare she put their personal disagreement ahead of their duty to the crown and the British people? The monarchy had survived for centuries by placing institutional stability above individual desires, and here was his own wife suggesting that her maternal feelings were more important than their shared constitutional obligations. But as the initial shock wore off, Charles found himself grappling with more complex emotions. He genuinely loved Camilla, had fought for decades to be able to marry her despite enormous public and institutional opposition. She had supported him through his mother's death, his accession to the throne, and the countless challenges of establishing his reign. She had transformed herself from a private citizen into an effective queen consort, earning public respect and affection that many had thought impossible. The study door opened quietly, and Sir Michael Hartwell entered carrying his own copy of the letter, which Camilla had sent simultaneously to ensure there could be no misunderstanding about her intentions. "Your Majesty," Sir Michael said carefully, "I assume you've read Her Majesty's communication." Charles turned from the window, his expression grim. "I've read it. I assume you have as well, which means this is no longer a private family matter." "No, sir, I'm afraid it's not." The Queen Consort made it quite clear that she considers this a matter requiring formal resolution through official channels. Charles returned to his desk and picked up the letter, reading through it again more slowly. The language was formal but unmistakably personal, combining constitutional terminology with emotional appeals that revealed the depth of Camilla's feelings about the situation. "She's serious about this," he said, though it was more of a statement than a question. "I believe she is, Your Majesty. I spent considerable time yesterday trying to find alternative approaches that might satisfy her concerns without creating the public difficulties she's now threatening." Charles looked up at his private secretary with sharp attention. "And what did you conclude?" Sir Michael shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the position he found himself in. "I concluded that Her Majesty views this as a fundamental test of your marriage rather than a negotiable policy question. She believes you've made decisions that effectively exclude her from family matters that are central to her identity and happiness. And you think she's right?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond palace protocol. Sir Michael had served the royal family for decades, had navigated countless diplomatic crises and constitutional challenges. But he had never been asked by a monarch to essentially judge the merits of their marriage dispute. "Your Majesty, I think Her Majesty feels that her position as your wife has been subordinated to institutional considerations in ways that were not clearly established when you married. She appears to believe that becoming queen consort was supposed to elevate her family's status, not diminish it." Charles set the letter down and rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of the headache that had become increasingly frequent since ascending to the throne. Every decision seemed to create new complications, new conflicts between his personal desires and his constitutional duties. "The problem, Michael, is that she's not wrong about the institutional pressures. The monarchy is under constant scrutiny, constant criticism for being too large, too expensive, too removed from ordinary people's lives. Every family member who appears at official events, every person who's included in royal gatherings, becomes a target for media analysis and public criticism." "Yes, sir, but, with respect, Mr. Parker Bowles and Miss Lopez have generally received quite positive media coverage. They're seen as accomplished individuals who've built successful careers independent of royal connections. Their inclusion in family events has never generated significant criticism." Charles stood up and began pacing, a habit he had developed during particularly difficult conversations. "But it's not just about media coverage, is it? It's about establishing clear boundaries around who is and isn't part of the working royal family. If we include Camilla's children in major family events, what message does that send about the nature of royal relationships? Where do we draw the lines?" "Perhaps, Your Majesty, the question isn't where to draw the lines, but whether some lines should be drawn at all when it comes to family relationships." The comment was more direct than Sir Michael typically allowed himself, but the gravity of the situation seemed to require abandoning usual diplomatic caution. Charles stopped pacing and looked at his advisor with surprise. "You think I've handled this badly?" "I think, Your Majesty, that there may be a difference between managing the monarchy as an institution and managing your family as a husband. Her Majesty seems to feel that you've applied institutional logic to personal relationships in ways that she finds unacceptable." Charles returned to his chair, feeling suddenly tired despite the early hour. The weight of kingship that had seemed manageable during his long years as Prince of Wales now felt overwhelming. Every decision created ripple effects he hadn't anticipated. Every attempt to modernize and streamline the monarchy seemed to require sacrifices he hadn't fully considered. "What are our options?" he asked finally. Sir Michael consulted his notes, though he had obviously given considerable thought to this question already. "The most straightforward option is to accept Her Majesty's requirements and modify the Christmas guest list, and future family event protocols accordingly. This would resolve the immediate crisis, but might set a precedent for future conflicts. And the alternative? The alternative is to maintain your current position and deal with the consequences of Her Majesty's threatened withdrawal from official duties. This would almost certainly become a public crisis within days, possibly hours. Charles leaned back in his chair, contemplating scenarios he had never imagined having to consider. A queen consort who refused to perform official duties would be unprecedented in modern royal history. The media speculation alone would be devastating, and the constitutional implications were unclear. How long could we manage without her participation in official events? Not long, Your Majesty. Her Majesty has a full schedule of engagements over the next several weeks, including several high-profile appearances that would be impossible to cancel or reassign without generating enormous media attention. More importantly, the public has grown quite fond of her. Her absence would be noticed immediately. Charles thought about the upcoming state dinner for the President of France, the charity galas where Camilla's presence had become essential, the regular public engagements that had become the backbone of royal public relations. Camilla had transformed herself into one of the monarchy's most effective representatives, earning public affection that had seemed impossible during their controversial early years together. She knows exactly what she's doing, he said with grudging admiration. She's chosen the one threat that I can't ignore or minimize. Yes, sir. I believe she has. Charles picked up the letter again, focusing on the final sentences where Camilla had written about the principles that had sustained their marriage through decades of challenge and change. She wrote about love, loyalty, and mutual respect not as abstract concepts but as practical commitments that required daily choices and ongoing sacrifice. For the first time since reading the letter, Charles allowed himself to imagine how the situation might look from Camilla's perspective. She had given up her privacy, her anonymity, and much of her independence to marry him and support his role as king. She had endured decades of public criticism and personal attack to stand beside him. And now, when she asked him to include her children in their family life, he was telling her that institutional concerns outweighed her maternal feelings. Michael, he said slowly, what do you think would happen if I simply said yes? If I accepted her requirements and included Tom and Laura in future family events? Honestly, Your Majesty, I think very little would happen. The public generally likes your stepchildren. The media has been positive about their accomplishments, and their presence at family gatherings has never generated significant controversy. Then, why did I think this was such a problem? Sir Michael hesitated before answering. Perhaps, Your Majesty, because you've been receiving advice from people who see potential problems rather than actual ones. Sometimes institutional caution can become institutional paralysis. Charles looked out the window again at his beloved gardens, thinking about the patience and faith required to plant seeds and trust them to grow into something beautiful and lasting. His marriage to Camilla had required the same kind of faith, the same willingness to nurture something precious despite uncertain conditions and hostile critics. Prepare a response to Her Majesty's letter, he said finally. Tell her that I accept her requirements, and that we'll work together to revise the Christmas arrangements and future family protocols. Yes, Your Majesty. And the formal ultimatum about her official duties? Charles smiled for the first time since reading Camilla's letter. Tell her that I hope she won't let a good crisis go to waste. If she's going to threaten to stop performing royal duties, she should at least negotiate for something more valuable than Christmas dinner invitations. As Sir Michael left to draft the response, Charles remained in his study, contemplating the lesson he had almost learned too late. The crown might require many sacrifices, but it shouldn't require him to sacrifice the love and loyalty of the woman who had chosen to share its weight. The telephone call came just as Camilla was finishing her afternoon tea, the delicate china cups still warm in her hands as she sat in the conservatory at Clarence House. The October rain drummed gently against the glass panels above her head, creating a peaceful atmosphere that had helped calm her nerves during the most stressful week of her marriage. 3 days had passed since she had sent her ultimatum to Charles, 3 days of waiting for a response that would determine not just the future of their marriage, but the very nature of her role within the royal family. She had spent those days maintaining her normal schedule, attending a charity luncheon and hosting a reception for literacy advocates, but the tension had been evident to everyone around her. Your Majesty, Sir Michael Hartwell's voice came through clearly despite the poor weather. His Majesty would like to speak with you. He's calling from Highgrove. Camilla set down her teacup and took a deep breath. "Put him through, please." There was a brief pause, the subtle click of a secure line being connected, and then Charles's familiar voice filled the conservatory. "Camilla? Are you there?" "I'm here, Charles." Her voice was steady, though her heart was beating faster than usual. "I've been thinking about your letter," he said without preamble. "Actually, I've been thinking about very little else since I received it." Camilla waited, knowing that Charles needed to work through his thoughts in his own way, at his own pace. After nearly 20 years of marriage, she had learned to recognize the difference between his public speaking voice and his private reflection voice. This was definitely the latter. "I want to apologize," he continued. "Not just for the Christmas guest list, but for the way I've been making decisions about our family without consulting you. You were right to call it a fundamental breach of our marriage." The words hit Camilla with unexpected force. In all their years together, through all their conflicts and reconciliations, Charles had rarely offered such direct acknowledgement of his mistakes. He was a man who had been raised to believe that royal authority meant never having to admit error, never showing weakness or uncertainty in judgment. "Charles," she began, but he continued speaking. "I've been so focused on establishing my reign, on proving that I could be an effective king after waiting so long for the throne, that I lost sight of what actually matters. I convinced myself that streamlining the monarchy meant making hard choices about family relationships. But the truth is I was just being a coward." Camilla felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This was the Charles she had fallen in love with decades ago, the man who could see beyond protocol and institution to the human heart of every situation. "You weren't being a coward," she said gently. "You were trying to do your duty as you understood it. But you were also excluding me from decisions that affected my children, and that hurt more than I think you realized." "I realize it now," Charles replied. "Michael showed me the correspondence file about Tom and Laura, all the memos and assessments that led to the Christmas decision. Reading through it, I felt sick. These are people we love, people who have brought joy and pride to our lives, and I was treating them like strategic liabilities." The relief flooding through Camilla was so intense, it was almost physical. For months, she had been questioning her own judgment, wondering if she was being unreasonable to expect her children to remain central to their family life. Hearing Charles acknowledge the error of his approach validated everything she had been feeling. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we fix this. Tom and Laura will be included in the Sandringham Christmas gathering, obviously. But more than that, I want to work with you to establish some clear principles about how we make family decisions going forward. No more unilateral choices about the people you love." Camilla closed her eyes, feeling a tension she had carried for months finally beginning to release. "And the broader questions about the monarchy? Your concerns about public perception and institutional efficiency?" Charles was quiet for a moment before responding. "I think I confused modernizing the monarchy with isolating it. The British people don't want a royal family that's cut off from normal human relationships and emotions. They want us to be relatable while still maintaining dignity, to be both extraordinary and recognizably human. And Tom and Laura help with that. Tom and Laura represent exactly what people hope to see in a royal family. They're accomplished, independent, genuine people who happen to love their mother and support her role. Including them in our family life doesn't weaken the monarchy. It strengthens it by showing that we value the same things ordinary families value." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering practical details about Christmas arrangements and longer-term protocols for family events. But, more importantly, it re-established the partnership that had sustained their marriage through decades of external pressure and internal challenge. 2 weeks later, Camilla stood in the drawing room at Sandringham House, watching her grandchildren play board games with Prince George and Princess Charlotte while Tom and Laura chatted easily with the Prince and Princess of Wales near the fireplace. The scene was everything she had hoped for when she first imagined Christmas as part of the royal family, natural and warm despite the grandeur of the surroundings. Charles appeared at her elbow, following her gaze toward the comfortable chaos of family life unfolding before them. "Any regrets about your ultimatum?" he asked with a slight smile. "None whatsoever," Camilla replied. "Though I have to admit, I wasn't entirely sure you'd see reason." "I wasn't entirely sure I would either," Charles admitted. "But you were right about the fundamentals. A monarchy that can't maintain loving family relationships isn't worth preserving." Laura noticed them standing together and walked over, her face bright with the happiness that had been missing during the difficult months leading up to this moment. "Mom, The children want to know if we can go for a walk around the estate before dinner. Tom's promised to tell them stories about the time you got lost in these same woods when you were young. Camilla laughed, remembering the incident from decades earlier when she had first visited Sandringham as Charles's guest. I was not lost, I was exploring. There's a difference. Tell that to the search party they had to send out to find you, Charles said with amusement. I think half the Norfolk police were involved before you turned up covered in mud, but completely unbothered. As her family prepared for their walk, bundling into coats and scarves against the December cold, Camilla reflected on how close she had come to losing this simple pleasure. The ultimatum she had sent to Charles had felt like the most dangerous gamble of her life, but it had also been the most necessary. That evening, after the children had been tucked into bed and the adults had gathered in the library for brandy and conversation, Tom approached his mother and stepfather as they stood together near the Christmas tree. I wanted to thank you both, he said quietly, not just for including us in this Christmas, but for working through whatever needed to be worked through to get here. Charles extended his hand to Tom, but Tom surprised him by offering a hug instead. I know this couldn't have been easy for either of you. Family relationships never are, especially when there are crowns and public expectations involved. Family relationships are the only things that make crowns and public expectations bearable, Charles replied, returning the hug with genuine warmth. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their private quarters at Sandringham, Camilla and Charles reflected on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful resolution. I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't sent that letter, Charles said as he brushed his teeth. How long might I have continued making decisions that pushed your children away? I don't think you would have continued much longer, Camilla replied, removing her jewelry at the dressing table. You're not cruel, Charles, and you're not stupid. Eventually, you would have seen what you were doing to our family. But would it have been too late by then? Would Tom and Laura have given up on being part of our lives? It was a sobering question, and Camilla considered it seriously before answering. I don't know, but I'm grateful we didn't have to find out. Charles sat on the edge of the bed, looking tired but more relaxed than he had appeared in months. You know what surprised me most about this whole crisis? What? How quickly everything changed once I stopped fighting and started listening. All the institutional concerns that seemed so important, all the strategic considerations that kept me awake at night, they just evaporated once I focused on what actually mattered. Camilla joined him on the bed, taking his hand in hers. Maybe that's the real lesson here. The monarchy will survive or fail based on whether it serves human happiness and human values, not whether it follows abstract institutional principles. Do you think we'll face similar challenges in the future? Charles asked. Other situations where my duty as king conflicts with my obligations as a husband and stepfather? Probably, Camilla said honestly. But now we have a framework for dealing with them. We talk to each other before making major decisions. We consider the impact on our family relationships alongside the institutional implications. We remember that the monarchy exists to serve the British people, and the British people want their royal family to demonstrate the same values they try to live by themselves. Charles squeezed her hand. Love, loyalty, mutual respect, and the courage to fight for what matters most. Exactly. The same values that made me send you that letter, and the same values that made you wise enough to accept its message. As they settled into sleep in the comfortable bed at Sandringham, surrounded by the sounds of a house full of family members who had been successfully brought back together, both Charles and Camilla felt a deep sense of gratitude for the crisis that had nearly destroyed their marriage but had ultimately strengthened it. The next morning brought news that would validate their reconciliation in ways they hadn't expected. The royal correspondent for the Times had somehow learned about Tom and Laura's inclusion in the Christmas gathering and had written a warmly positive article about the royal family's commitment to maintaining close relationships with extended family members. The King and Queen Consort's decision to include the Queen Consort's children and grandchildren in the Sandringham Christmas celebration sends a powerful message about the values that guide the modern monarchy, the article read. In an era when many families struggle to maintain connections across generational and geographical divides, seeing the royal family prioritize these relationships provides both inspiration and reassurance. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with social media filled with comments praising the royal family for demonstrating that titles and duties need not interfere with basic family loyalty. Many people shared their own stories of fighting to keep extended families together during difficult times, drawing parallels between their struggles and the royal family's commitment to inclusive family relationships. Sir Michael Hartwell delivered the morning press summary with a smile wider than Camilla had ever seen him wear. It appears, Your Majesty, that your instincts about public opinion were correct. Including family members in royal celebrations is seen as a strength, not a weakness. Charles looked at the press coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and embarrassment. I suppose I should have trusted the British people's judgment about family values from the beginning. Live and learn, Your Majesty, Sir Michael replied diplomatically. As Christmas week progressed, the extended royal family settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and sustainable. Tom helped organize cooking demonstrations for the children, sharing his professional knowledge in ways that delighted both the young ones and the adults. Laura led art projects that transformed ordinary pine cones and branches into elegant decorations that even the most formal palace staff admitted improved the aesthetic of the reception rooms. Most importantly, Camilla found herself able to be both queen consort and mother without feeling torn between competing loyalties. She could discuss state business with Charles over breakfast, and then help her grandchildren write letters to Father Christmas without feeling as though she was betraying one role to fulfill the other. On the final evening of their stay, as the family gathered for a last dinner together, Charles stood to offer a toast that surprised everyone with its personal nature. I want to thank all of you for being here, he said, raising his glass toward the assembled family members. Not just for being here tonight, but for being patient with an old man who sometimes loses sight of what's truly important. He paused, looking around the table at faces that had become dear to him over the years. This year has taught me that the strength of the monarchy lies not in its ability to maintain distance and formality, but in its capacity to demonstrate the values that matter most to ordinary families. Love, loyalty, forgiveness, and the wisdom to fight for relationships that bring meaning to our lives. The toast was met with warm applause and more than a few tears. Later, as they all prepared to return to their respective homes and responsibilities, there was a sense of completion, of a family crisis successfully navigated and transformed into deeper understanding. Camilla's ultimatum had worked not because it forced Charles to choose between the crown and his family, but because it helped him understand that the two were not actually in conflict. The modern monarchy needed to embody the best of British family values, and those values included the fierce protection of loved ones and the courage to fight for what matters most. In the end, the crisis that had nearly torn them apart had instead taught them how to build a stronger, more authentic version of royal family life, one that honored both their public duties and their private loves.